Our last speaker of the day is Chris Rainier. He is a special adventurer. You know, Mickey Edwards came from Aspen. Chris Rainier, to be here today, Chris Rainier came from Bangladesh. He's an explorer, a chronicler of our wilderness and indigenous cultures. He's considered one of the leading documentary photographers in the world today. His life's mission is to put on film both the remaining natural wilderness and indigenous cultures around the globe, and to use images to create social change. He is a National Geographic Fellow, and early on, for 14 years, he was Ansel Adams' photography assistant. Chris, welcome to the stage.
Thank you. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here, and what an amazing day. I feel so humbled to be sitting around in the back with astronauts and all sorts of people. I want to also thank Randy for inviting me here. He's a very dear friend of the National Geographic. I'm here today to talk about a fire that's burning around the world. And this is a fire consuming culture and language loss. Every 2 weeks, an elder somewhere on this planet dies. We live in a planet where of the 7,000 languages, 80% are oral. So when that elder dies, it's like burning down a library. We are living in an era when we are complacent to the loss of so much cultural and intellectual diversity. Of those 7,000 languages, barely 50% are being taught to children. So when they're not taught to the children, they're essentially extinct. So there is a race against time. We talk about the biosphere going into extinction. We'll run the numbers of imagine a language dying every 2 weeks. And it's not just a quaint language lost in an Amazon jungle where people have pretty feathers and bells on and dance. Embedded in these languages are complex understandings of local ecosystems, malaria, potentially the cure to cancer. The list goes on and on and on. And only now does modern science begin to realize that there are a lot of parallels that we need to be paying attention to. Wouldn't it be a shame as we come to this realization that in fact there is no knowledge left because 80% of the world's languages are oral and we've lost them all? But let me go back a little bit to my journey as a photographer. I began my journey in these canyons in the Southwest Desert in the early 1980s. I was Ansel Adams' photographic assistant, as mentioned, and what free time I had, I'd spent out in the Four Corners, Colorado, Arizona, Utah, looking at the ancient symbols of cultures. What I learned from Ansel Adams at that point was photography could be used as a social tool. It could change and transform the way people thought about their world around them. In fact, look what he did in the early 1980s, and his photography lives way beyond him, continuing to preserve some of the great natural landscapes of the world. After I left the Ansel Adams studio in 1980, I set off on a mission, a lifetime mission, to use my photography as a social tool and to put on film cultures living from the past, living in the present for future generations. One of the first places I went to was Varanasi, the city of light, the oldest city in India. For a Hindu to die in Varanasi naturally is to be ensured of the ultimate transformation into enlightenment, ending the cycle of karma. Each morning people come down to the Ganges, a river that flows from the high Himalayas, to pray and bathe in the early bright white light of Varanasi. Varanasi is home to Lord Brahma, the creator, Lord Shiva, the destroyer, the two most powerful Hindu gods. The struggle between these two forces is the struggle between good and bad, light and dark, to infinity into Dante's Inferno. Here you will find the Lord of the Untouchables, the keeper of the burning guts, and the spirit being that holds the key to a person's reincarnation. And with his morning offerings to the river Ganges, a Hindu man can be assured life is again in karmic balance. My journey continued on to Africa. My father is South African, and I really realized as the years and the decades went on, the race that I had with trying to document these cultures, putting them on film, archiving them as much as possible. So Africa, I fell in love with Africa. I fell in love with this part of the Africa over in Egypt, the beginning of the Sahara Desert. If you're lucky enough and you sit there and watch the Tuaregs, the Bedouins of the desert, come in from the Sahara Desert as far as west as Egypt or even Chad and Libya, and just kind of get off their camels and pray to these amazing monuments. I will often try and go and photograph at sacred sites, powerful places like the pyramids, like Taj Mahal, like Machu Picchu on a full moon. I had spent the night on the full moon the night before up on one of those pyramids. I fell in love. I wanted to go further into the desert. I put together an expedition over in Mali, which is now in the news a lot, out of Timbuktu. And we went north, distance out from the desert, up towards this ancient salt mine, passing through these little medieval oases where these men wrapped up in Tuaregs are probably the bandits and the so-called Al-Qaeda of today. And the Sahara Desert is absolutely amazing. My guide kept talking about the eye of the needle. I kept asking, what do you mean of the eye of the needle? He spoke of this place where the sand dunes run east and west, and the only safe place to take the camels through the sand dunes was a place called the Eye of the Needle. Passing again through these villages where the men would gather on Friday to come inside their churches, their mosques, and read the Quran, and after their prayers, sit under the light and read the Quran in peace. And if you're lucky enough to be there on the end of Ramadan or a special occasion, the women painted with the henna dye all over their hands and feet. Every afternoon, our guide would step up to the top of the sand dunes and chart across the ancient sand dunes that his father had took him and his grandfather had taken his father. No modern navigation whatsoever, trusting the stars, the patterns of the sand, and eventually it would bring them to this amazing place that was a scene out of the ancient Bible, this old salt mine where still black African slaves work even today, and it is a tradition that has gone on since the 13th century. In fact, it drew so much attention on the area that camel caravans would come from as far away as Basra, Cairo, northern Africa, Timbuktu, at the epicenter of its great richer cultural awareness. And this is much of what's being talked about in the news these days, is preserving the scriptures, had 30,000 scholars. The University of Timbuktu in Mali. Amazing. So, chip away at these salt blocks. They rest the camels, they load the camels up, and then they head back on down to Timbuktu, where these salt blocks are sold. Now, why would they be sold in a modern world where you can get salt from Europe so much easier? Because it is the fabric that keeps a culture together. If you start taking those threads of fabric out, it all begins to fall apart. And of course, this is what so much of what's going on around our world today as modernity steps in. You head to the furthest southern part of Mali, you arrive with the Dogon that live up in the Bandagara Hills, and this is a young initiate with his surgay mask, and he dances as he is initiated from childhood into adulthood with this mask. And for that moment, he is the surrogate between the spiritual world and the earthly world. You head on further south, and you arrive in Burkina Faso, where the ancient mask, the modern primitive masks, are still etched, and this is a fascinating part of the world. And my interest in this area was indeed not only the ancient modern primitive masks, was the scarification. I did a book that took me 10 years to wander around the world to photograph not only tattooing in traditional cultures, but when the skin is very dark, ancient scarification. In many, many cultures around the world, as you go from a childhood into an adult, adulthood into a warrior, there's a status that you go through of changing up into a more elite status. It's also, in many traditional cultures around the world, they believe that part of your body, until it is marked, either with a tattoo or scarification, is the way stories are told. An unmarked canvas, an unmarked body, is merely a story waiting to be told. You come up the east coast of Africa, and you end up in Ethiopia, one of my favorite places to travel to, and I'll be putting together an expedition and going back there later this year. You're now in the Mercy tribe, where the young girls, as a part of an initiation ritual, had their lower lip slit, a plate put in, and a larger plate put in, and it is a form of empowerment and form of initiation as well. And then you end up in another part of Ethiopia, on the border with Kenya. And I wanted to kind of have a walk through Africa experience. Hired a young guide here, Jackson. He'd been educated in Addis Ababa, gotten tired with modernity, had come back to his village. He was being trained. We walked across the plains of Africa, literally sleeping under the stars at night. The only thing he had was this sword, and we could hear the lions roar, the elephants. It was a magical day after creation kind of experience. I fired him with questions for 5 days. At the end, the last night, around the campfire, he said, "Chris, I have some questions for you." I said, "I'll try." He said, "What are your initiation rituals in your culture? What do you do with your elders when they're too old to work with the cattle in the land? And in the end, what do you do to preserve the land for future generations?" I was stumped. What are our initiation rituals in our culture? And he had read, in fact, about a Navajo elder from the United States, where not only they preserved the land for the next generation, they preserved it for 7 generations down. And I will come back to that story. Now, as a part of Africa, you can not only talk about one foot in the Garden of Eden, but there's a lot of conflict. I worked for Time magazine for many years as a war photographer, and one of my first experiences was in Somalia, the Civil War, early 1990s. Up to that point, I had been trained as a photojournalist. Everything in my camera was to be objective. I showed up for duty. If it didn't happen through my lens, it wasn't experienced. Until one day, I was driving along in a Red Cross vehicle, and we noticed shimmering off in the distance was this old man and his son. His wife, 3 children had already passed away, and I had my camera. Chance favors a prepared mind. I jumped out, photographed him as he reached out from the darkness into the light, into the hope. We brought him up on the truck, still photographing. I kept photographing, and then I distinctly remember I put my camera down, offered the old man a bottle of water, and said, "I will take your son." The story now had engulfed me. About 10 minutes later, his son died in my arms. Crashed my world around. How could I be objective? How could I live in a world of objectivity when towns like the one right here in Baidoa, 400 people a day were dying? I could not be objective. There's no way as a storyteller I can be objective. I can be passionate, and I have to be compassionate. And that has informed the way I tell stories ever since that day unfolded to the day I continue today to photograph for National Geographic. Ended up staying for almost a year in Somalia, and then went on to work with Time magazine, and then moved to Bosnia and lived there for close to a year. Now, one of my favorite places to travel is the island of New Guinea. The island of New Guinea is just north of Australia, and it is an ancient landscape where man still does indeed have one foot in the Garden of Eden. These are cultures where they're still alive, where masks still dance in the forest. There are initiations for birth and death and jobs and marriage and war and all sorts of things like that. I would often travel by months by dugout canoe or fly up into an isolated runway, put together an expedition, and head on in. And I spent almost 10 years of my life spending close to 6 months doing this. And what transformed for me were amazing stories that I thought, this is so important for us to preserve. We're at this amazing crossroads of human evolution. One afternoon, I had heard about a young boy being initiated. I came up and over that hill, and off to the side was an elder. And he spoke to me through a translator. And in the island of New Guinea that has almost 2,000 languages, not dialects, 2,000 languages, you can literally go from one valley to the next and there to be a different language group. And he said, "Which valley are you from?" And I smiled and I said, "Many, many valleys away." And he said, "No, which valley are you from?" And he kept persisting. And then he answered it for himself. He said, "Aha. You're from where the green meets the blue. You're from that place, the color of the sky, when the land ends, it's blue. And I wrote that down in my journal, and in a way, we're all from where the green meets the blue. We're from this amazing, amazing, fragile planet that we are so responsible for preserving. So doing a book, doing a project on New Guinea, one of the main rituals is to photograph war, which is a very ritualized process. So just before I went into this valley, several valleys back in, and photographed this ritualized warfare, I got a phone call from Time magazine, said, would you be in Sarajevo to replace out a photographer in about 6 weeks? I said yes, went in, spent several weeks, we photographed this battle, came out. Within 5 days, I was in Sarajevo in the middle of some of the worst conflict in Europe in the latter part of the 20th century, and it stunned me. I realized I'd gone from the Stone Age to modern European history, and we have this conceit. We have this conceit that we have evolved. We have done nothing but evolve the sophisticated ability to kill ourselves. So, indeed, New Guinea was an amazing experience. Down in the area that Michael Rockefeller disappeared, I photographed these guys, war canoes. And as much as life is a part of New Guinea, so too is death. When someone passes away, the women will often cover themselves with mud, put Job's tears on. In this area, the woman's husband has passed away. No one is allowed to see her eyes. And the two brothers have their heads shaved. But most interestingly, the raton necklace is a symbolic connection to the spirit of that person. When that necklace drops off, rots off, the spirit is free to go to the afterworld. After traveling close to 8 years, the guide that I had worked with almost every expedition passed away. So we took his body back to the village, and they built a spirit canoe, a symbolic canoe that is pushed off at sunset into the afterworld. One of the great privileges of being a traveler, an explorer, is to make contact with people that have never seen the outside world. We did that in New Guinea, and what a privilege. We hiked back 3 weeks. We had surmised that there was a group back in there. Indeed, there was a group. We spent about 10 days photographing them, doing interviews, lots of film and communication and common building. Last afternoon, my camera bag is packed up. It's beside me. Beautiful day. The kids are frolicking around me. A thunderstorm comes rolling up the hill. The people put on these wonderful raton banana leaf raincoats. The storm spreads. The sun comes out. It's about 5 in the afternoon. Kids playing around. And I look up in the sky. And some 30,000 feet above me is a jet stream on its way from Sydney or Cairns to Singapore or Hong Kong. And well, it struck me. What an amazing time to be alive, that we still do have people that live beyond the frayed edge of the map. And yet we have all this modern technology, all of this technology that we've been talking about today. So here we are, barely into the 21st century. Let us take one last look over our shoulder at the millennium behind us. What cultural traditions do we leave behind? And which ones do we carry with us in this new century of technology, information, and profound cultural choices? How will these new tools affect us? Already, via the internet, the Navajo elder who I was mentioning has already shared his stories with Jackson, my guide. I've already connected them. The world is connecting. While an Ethiopian priest, after his morning prayers and before the morning light falls on his computer, will be emailing his shaman friend in Asia. And why not? There are cyber cafes in Timbuktu and smartphones with educational, medical, and language apps in the jungles of New Guinea. We're all a part of a monarch planet yearning now more than ever to dialogue among civilizations. Let us use this new technology to celebrate ancient traditions, to build profound bridges of communication, and share the stories of the cultures living beyond the edge of the map that lie deep in the desert of our existence. There's several programs that I'm involved in that I have started and I now co-direct, and it's around language loss and the importance of language hotspots and our awareness that these are the epicenters. If we do not go in here in the next 5 years, a huge wealth of human knowledge will disappear. So what we do is we go out, we're invited, and I stress the word we're invited, and we create opportunities to connect by computer, internet, using video, using still cameras. But it's not about the technology. It's about storytelling. These people, humans, are storytellers. It's giving them the opportunity by putting this equipment in front of them and allowing them to take their own narrative, their own dialogue, and begin to share the stories. We create a website, Google Translation. They have the ability to make that password sensitive. Many of these cultural stories are very sensitive to communities, even gender-related or age-related. We have it all password sensitive, and people are picking up this technology, picking up smartphones, picking up tablets, using them, and we're working with the technology companies to do this. It's incredibly exciting. And why should they be left behind? Who decides? They shouldn't be left behind. We should. Everybody should have access to information and awareness and cultural possibilities. Also, a part of our program is indeed photographic training. The classic image by Steve McCurry of the Afghani girl. Well, imagine if an Afghani girl had that opportunity. We gave an award to Farzana. She was the first graduate from a media school in Kabul in Afghanistan, post-Taliban. And her story is now going out around the world. This is not to replace Steve McCurry, but this is to create more chairs at the table of human dialogue. We have possibilities for other photographers as well, and we've done a number of different awards, putting them in front of the media, New York Times, creating opportunities for them to step up and have a dialogue. And this is what we're really talking about. So what I'd love to do, and these are some of the organizations we work with and continue to work with as well. So what I'd love to do to wrap up today is to give you a quote from my first book, Keepers of the Spirit. So as the chainsaws fell, if you could put those 4 slides on, please. So as the chainsaws fell the last trees that hide the first peoples, we're alive at an amazing moment in human evolution. We are alive at an amazing moment in human evolution. The rich tapestry of human culture, that fabric that is made up of the dazzling array of man's diversity, is at a crucial crossroads. Will we let go and sever that fragile umbilical cord to our primitive past, finding ourselves truly alone, without cultural purpose, adrift in a vast sea of space with nowhere to go? Or will we make a different choice? It is my hope that we can all gather around the fireplace of humanity and continue for generations to tell the stories of what it means to be alive on a planet that has survived the 21st century. Please join us. This is a crucial issue. Many crucial issues have been talked about today, but our survival into the 21st century is all about cultural and intellectual diversity as well. Thank you very much.